Now the fifth dispensation is a lengthy dispensation, and that is called the Dispensation of the Mosaic Law. It covers a lengthy period of time beginning with Exodus chapter 19 verse 1 all the way until Acts chapter 1 verse 26. The dispensation of law then covered the entire span of time from Exodus 19 throughout the rest of the Old Testament and the intertestamental period and through gospel history until we finally come to the second chapter of Acts where the dispensation finally changes. Now the key person was Moses. It was to Moses that God was given a lot of revelation on which the new dispensation was going to be based. Secondly, concerning the name for this dispensation is called the Dispensation of Law because God's economy was being dispensed through the law of Moses, which contained a total of 613 specific commandments. Now thirdly, concerning man's responsibility, man was responsible to the Mosaic covenant. That was the covenant to which he had responsibility to, and contained within the covenant involved two major areas. Number one, they were responsible to obey the 613 commandments of the law of Moses, and then secondly, they were to obey the prophets that God would send that would further obey the law, define the law, give meaning to the law, and explain it. So they were to obey the law and the prophets. Fourthly, or the fourth facet, is the test, and the specific test involved two major things. Number one, they were to do the whole law. They're responsible to keep the entire law with all of its 613 commandments, because to break only one of these commandments meant to incur guilt for breaking them all, according to James chapter 2 verse 10. So the first part of the test was to do the whole law. The second part of the test was to accept and believe the prophet that would arise that would be like unto Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 15 through 18. Or in other words, they were to accept the Messiah once the Messiah came, because the Messiah was going to be the prophet like unto Moses, and that was the test. The fifth facet came failure, and they failed in both aspects of the test. Number one, they failed to keep the law, as is brought out by Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. They failed to keep the law in its entirety. And in fact, not only did they fail to keep the law, they tried to get around the law by establishing their own righteousness and by putting in their own laws and say they obeyed their laws and feel therefore they did not have to obey the laws of the Lord. And then, secondly, they also failed in that they failed to accept the Messiah. And I have many gospel passages that emphasize this. Perhaps the best one is Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 39. That whole chapter, Jesus denounces the scribes and the Pharisees, leadership of Israel of that day, because number one, they rejected his messianic claims, but secondly, they were leading the nation to the rejection of those same messianic claims. So the sixth facet came, and that was the judgment, and the judgment came in 70 A.D., and the judgment involved also two things. Number one, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and secondly, the worldwide dispersion of the Jewish people as they were exiled from the land. But the seventh facet was also present, and that was the facet of grace. And the facet of grace was seen throughout the dispensation of law in two ways. Number one was the sacrificial system. because while the Jew was not able to keep all 613 commandments, where the Jew failed, this was covered by the sacrificial system. And so God provided the sacrificial system as a means for restoring the sinner. The sacrificial system did not take away their sin, and no Jew was ever saved because he merely brought a sacrifice to the tabernacle or the temple. Like in every age, the Jew was saved by grace through faith. That was the element that saved him, his faith. But his faith had to have content. In this case, the content of his faith was the sacrificial system. And when he brought that sacrifice to the temple or tabernacle, he had the faith that by the means of the shedding of blood, his sins would be covered and fellowship would be restored. The second way grace was displayed during this dispensation was by God's provisions of judges and kings and prophets. Judges were given to deliver the Jews from subjugation to various peoples. Righteous kings were provided to give them a kingdom of righteousness and justice. And prophets were sent in order to expound the law and to bring the people back and to remind them of where they had failed and to call them to repent.